welcome to the next of these faith formation seminars. Well, the talk was advertised as being on Sloth, or Sloth, which is a fine animal, as you know, and one of the 7 deadly sins of the Western tradition. But the idea of this series was to go behind the Western tradition a bit to its to its Eastern sources, and also to go behind sins. That's to say, sinful actions, to their sources, to what makes us sin, which the Desert Fathers variously call passions, and sometimes demons. And our 4th century guide, this great man here, Evagrius, calls them logismoi, which means thoughts, but not just passing thoughts, but the things that gnaw away inside us and drive us and take over our minds. So tonight we'll look at another of Evagrius's thoughts, the one that, as it were, lies behind sloth. So it's this one. Now, I'm never sure really how you're meant to pronounce it. But I think, sorry, some of you can't see the board. I think acedia will do anyway, acedia. And if we flip over a bit, we come, there we are, there it is. And acedia is English and Latin, and it comes from the Greek word Acadia or Acadia. Another English version of it is, well, really don't know how to pronounce that, Axidi or Acidi or something, but there's just another version. Acedia, I think, is easier, and that has come through. If you look in the back of the catechism or wherever, you'll see the list of 7 deadly sins. And there we have sloth. But as I'll explain, it's not quite as simple as that. We must make things a little more exciting and complicated. Well, now we've already looked at gluttony, lust, avarice, and anger. And those of you who are there may remember that the first 3 of those link to what is called, the sort of ancient writers would call the concupiscible appetite, our love of pleasure, especially physical pleasure. But the 4th, anger, connects to our irascible appetite, which doesn't necessarily mean we're losing our temper all the time, but it's our instinct to fight. So we want something, we desire to get and to have, that's our concupiscible appetite, but there's an obstacle in our way, so we fight to remove it. And the thoughts, these thoughts of gluttony, lust, avarice, and anger are these 2 appetites, sometimes one, the concupiscible, sometimes the irascible. They're, as it were, misdirected, or you can say in overdrive, running into excess, going too far. But with this fellow, or lady, I suppose, because she ends in A, acedia, we enter into deeper water. Because, have you heard of acedia, by the way? Any of you? Yeah, okay, Guillaume. But I don't know, is it a familiar concept at all, a word you've heard? Yeah. It doesn't stem from one particular aspect of ourselves, one bit of ourselves. It doesn't, that's one thing, and it doesn't have a clear contrary virtue. If you've got lust, then the opposite virtue is chastity. If you have gluttony, the opposite virtue is temperance, and so on. It's very broad and pervasive thing, acedia. It's like an oil slick. It sort of oozes and penetrates and drips, and it goes through the whole system. Now, Evagrius says it is the most oppressive and the heaviest of all the logismoi, and it envelops the whole soul. It takes hold of every faculty. It's not simply identical with laziness or sloth, though these are symptoms of it, and it's sometimes called spiritual sloth. Nor is it the same as the psychological affliction of depression, though there is a kinship. It is a kind of spiritual depression. Now, a key point, it gets quite exciting, this, really. A key point is that it attacks this demon, or this thought, logismos, this sort of sloth hanging on a tree. It sort of drops down on you and it wraps itself round you. And it attacks particularly those seriously committed to the spiritual life. Now that's something you've got to bear in mind in everything that follows. So what is it? What is it, this acedia? Well, etymologically, and the origin of the word, it means being without care. In other words, careless, carelessness, or in the sense of, not in the nice sense of being carefree, but in the sense of I couldn't care less, I'm not bothered. And now I'm going to give you a list of one-word synonyms, and put them in alphabetical order for fun. Now, I don't know if you play darts, but you know if you've ever played darts, how that game works. You throw the darts at the board, and you want to get, the thing is what's called the treble 20 in the middle. Now, not all these. Sorry.
I just want to get on the board most of the time.
Now, not all these words are treble 20s if you're trying to decide to say what acedia is, but I think they're all on the board. Or if you like, you've got a planet, and these are some of the moons that swim around the planet, and cumulatively they may give a picture. Okay, so we'll go through the alphabet. Well, anxiety comes into acedia. Apathy, boredom, carelessness, cowardice, discouragement, disgust, disillusionment, dissatisfaction, dissipation, distaste, distraction, drowsiness, dullness. Well, seeing Guillaume there is a nice French word, engourdissement, which means a kind of numbness. Hopelessness, jumping to H. Inconstancy, indifference, insensibility, insensitivity, jumping to L. Languor, laziness, lethargy, listlessness. Negligence, numbness, paralysis, pointlessness, restlessness, slackness, sleepiness, sloth, and sluggishness, tepidity, torpor, weariness. Are you all asleep now? But remember, these words are linked to what is primarily a spiritual condition. They refer to the state of our Christian life. Now, Okay, those are single words. Let's have another run at it using some phrases. These are culled from a variety of sources, descriptive phrases of acedia. A vague, general dissatisfaction with no precise cause. Something you may have felt from time to time. Expecting nothing of anything. Time hanging heavy. The noonday demon. Now that's a phrase from Psalm 90. The demon of the middle of the day. Sadness according to the world. That's a phrase of St. Paul's. A thick, wet blanket inhibiting all energy and purpose. Enfeeblement of the soul. Fretful inability to find any sense of purpose in our daily routine. A kind of listless boredom which saps vitality and paralyzes the will. A strange mix of listlessness and restlessness, indifference and irritability at the same time. Then a line from the book of Proverbs. The soul of the sluggard craves. The deliberate frittering away of time in the attempt to escape choice and commitment. A form of depression due to lax ascetical practice. A drowsiness of the rational soul, a neglect of the virtues and of the knowledge of God. A failure to keep the Sabbath. Now that's a very profound one. And that comes from St. Thomas Aquinas. A refusal of the joy that comes from God. A sense of repulsion before the goodness of God. Now I hope you're all feeling thoroughly miserable. Okay. Now, after those words and phrases, 2 pen portraits, and they're each of them is from different ends of the whole spectrum of Christian life. Now this is, first of all, yes, you have to imagine yourself in the Egyptian desert, all alone, nobody in sight, just sand everywhere, and your little hut. And it's hot, very, very hot. And you are a hermit. And this is what, not without humour, Evagrius pictures. The demon of acedia, also called the noonday demon, is the most oppressive of all the demons. He launches his attack upon the monk at about 10 o'clock in the morning and besieges him until about 2 p.m. He begins by giving him the impression that the sun is scarcely moving, or that it has stopped moving altogether, and that the day is 50 hours long. Now, you've got to remember, this fellow hasn't had a meal yet, hasn't eaten anything. Then he impels the monk to repeatedly gaze through his window and to go outside of his cell to to scrutinize the sun to determine whether 3 p.m. is near, because that's mealtime. Sort of Meals on Wheels will come around the desert and he'll get his food. And finally, he gets him to survey every possible direction in the hope of being visited by a brother. He instills in him a hatred for the place where he lives, a hatred for his very way of life, a hatred for manual labour. He puts the thought into his head that charity has ceased to exist among the brethren. There are a few other monks scattered around. That there is no one on whom he can rely for encouragement. If someone has recently upset him, the demon uses this to add even more fuel to his hatred. The demon persuades him to desire other places where he can more readily procure what he needs and practice an easier, more prosperous trade. Not just weaving baskets all day long, which nobody wants to buy. He arouses within him memories of his family and of his former way of life. He makes it clear to him how long life is, and he sets before his eyes the toils of ascesis. Now, here's another description of the same chap, really. The eye of the monk, besieged by acedia, often stares at the windows, and with his imagination he fantasizes about visitors. Surely the telephone's going to ring. Somebody wants to talk to me. If the door creaks, he leaps up at once. If he hears a sound, he leans through the window and peeps out. And he will not sit down again until he becomes stiff from standing there. While the monk besieged by acedia reads, he frequently yawns and is easily weighed down by sleep. He rubs his eyes and stretches his arms. He takes his eyes off the book and stares at the wall. Returning once again to the book to read a little, he indulges his curiosity by flipping to the conclusions of the arguments. He counts the pages and calculates the number left. He criticizes the lettering and the decoration. Finally, he closes the book, places it under his head, and falls asleep. But not a very deep sleep, because he is soon awakened by hunger and the concerns that it causes. Now, that was written in the 4th century. I mean, that's pretty sharp, isn't it? Pretty sharp. Okay, now, the second one is almost just hot off the press. For the second one, imagine you're a priest or a religious or a layperson fully dedicated to the apostolate. But then, what Pope Francis, this is Pope Francis, in his recent writing called Evangelii Gaudium, the Joy of the Gospel, then what he calls pastoral acedia lays hold of you. Okay, so you're not a monk in the desert. You're a priest in Aberdeen or Inverness or something like that, or you're a religious, or you're a person, as it were, working for the church. Well, these are some of the symptoms that he mentions. It's pretty ferocious stuff. You will be unwilling to, this is what happens to you if this pastoral acedia gets a grip on you. You will be unwilling to persevere in a work over time, or obsessed with protecting your free time. You will undertake activity without adequate motivation, without a spirituality which would permeate it and make it pleasurable. You will experience a tense, burdensome, dissatisfying, and in the end, intolerable fatigue. You will lack patience, expect immediate results, be unable to wait. Your work will undergo a depersonalization. A grey pragmatism will occupy everything. Then he says this. Disillusioned, you see, disillusioned, there you are, same word. Disillusioned with reality, with the church, and with themselves, they experience a constant temptation to cling to a faint melancholy, lacking in hope, which seizes the heart, you see, like the most precious of the devil's potions. Called to radiate light and communicate life, in the end, they are caught up in things that generate only darkness and inner weariness, and slowly consume all zeal for the apostolate. Now that's laying it on pretty thick, like Evagrius. So there you've got two completely different ways of life in the church. You've got a hermit committed to prayer and basket weaving and such things, and you've got a pastoral worker, the other side, a priest or religious or a lay person, whatever. And this creature, this sloth, drops down from the tree and lands on top of you and wraps himself. It's very like in Tolkien, Mirkwood. You know Mirkwood, where there are these sort of spiders' webs and everything is just sort of unhealthy and sick, and you get tangled up and you can't really move and you don't know where you are. So, okay, clearly we're dealing with a very serious threat to any form of committed Christian life. So that's why I've taken these two extremes, because if acedia can get the two extremes, then it can get any of us who are in the middle. It can lay hold on us, an undermining of one's sense of personal vocation, an erosion of inner certainty about what I'm supposed to be doing in life. I mean, does some of this ring a bell? Okay. And this is what one chap says. Acedia is not just one temptation among many. It is quite simply the temptation. The calling into question of one's entire existence. The major identity crisis in which the very foundations of everything are severely shaken. Well, okay. Now at that point we can begin to turn things round, I think. But there's just one other slightly alarming thing that the fathers say about acedia, that you don't always know you've got it. You just think, well, that's what life's like. That's how everybody feels. Yes, at the risk of sounding pompous, but a key teaching of what I've been trying to say in these meetings, that these demons and thoughts are part and parcel of human life and of the committed Christian life. You know, we're not going to get through life without feeling gluttonous or lustful or avaricious or angry, obviously. These are going to be, you know, the famous prayer about the chap who's, I thank you, God. It's his morning prayer. How does it go now? I thank you, God, that... yes, I'm not grasping and adulterous, and I'm not avaricious, and I'm not tormented by gluttony. But please help me, because I'm just about to get out of bed. So... and this seems to be particularly true of acedia. You see, here's this old monk sitting in his cell, being no harm to anybody, and suddenly acedia grabs him. Here's Father Jorge in Buenos Aires rushing around doing good works, and this acedia lays hold of him. Here we are. So we're bound to meet it, and if it is met and faced down, then, says Evagrius, this is beginning to get some glimmers of good news, a great peace and joy will follow. Inexpressible peace and joy. And the demons actually will leave you alone, at least for a time. They will leave you alone. Now, it is the most oppressive demon of all, he says, but it leaves the soul proven to the highest degree. And a modern writer says this: to come through sloth is not only to believe in the goodness that God holds out to us, but to know it in body, mind, and heart. Now, this demon comes upon the desert hermit in the middle of the day. It's this noonday demon. I think you've got to be in a hot country for that, really. Oh dear. Yes, that's the alarm. But does it perhaps come upon the Christian in the middle of his life? The middle of his life. Is it perhaps a little like the midlife crisis? Now, let me say, here's a possible pattern in our Christian life. A person discovers Christianity, let's say, and commits themselves to the Christian way of life, as a Catholic. So, he or she, one accepts the teaching and the practice of the church. One goes to Mass and confession. One prays. One tries to live according to the moral teaching given, whatever be the circumstances of one's life. One tries to be good and follow Christ and so on. But gradually, joy is eroded. Drip by drip, something inside one is worn away. Fidelity doesn't seem to bring tangible rewards. Bad things happen in one's life or to those one loves. One may have negative experiences of people in the church, especially of the church's representatives. One becomes increasingly aware of the human dimension in the church. Some of the church's teaching begins to seem ridiculous and even inhuman. And one feels the force of the objections of those who don't accept it. One might find oneself getting caught up in protest movements or lobbies for change. Certainly, one becomes spiritually and in one's life in the church discontent. On the one hand, untouched, uninflamed, unignited by the things of God. These things the Eucharist or the Word of God or the Passion of Christ or the Resurrection of Christ, the person of Christ. These things don't cease to move one, to spark one. It all goes a bit dead. And on the other hand, one feels restless. One starts to look around at alternatives, the alternative religions even. And gradually one's mind is darkened while being apparently enlightened. And true faith is undermined. And one may throw it up altogether, or just become critical, cynical, or draw back and just plod on in a numb, disheartened way. Now, that's a possible, I'm afraid that's something that can happen to us, come upon us. And that would be acedia. It really would be. That's what it is. Yeah, and as I say, this final scary thing, that it has the knack of being imperceptible. Well, now, what is the remedy? Right, because the fathers are very keen on remedies. Well, now here Evagrius says a striking thing. He really does say some amazing things, this man. He says, divide your soul in two. Whoosh. In other words, start talking to yourself. Stand back within yourself and see this condition of acedia for what it is. Recognize the discouragement into which you have fallen and encourage yourself out of it. So he quotes Psalm 42. You may remember this, when the psalmist is talking to himself. Why are you saddened, O my soul, and why do you trouble me? Hope in God, for I shall confess him, the salvation of my face and my God. There's a more familiar translation, but anyway, that's the one. Why are you saddened, O my soul? Why do you trouble me? So you stand outside this thing that's clutching you, and you look at it, and you speak to yourself. Why are you like this? And then you say, hope in God, for I shall confess him. I shall praise him again. For he's the salvation of my face, and he is my God. Now, you may need someone else to help you do that. You know, he says, divide your soul in two, but you might need someone else who's going to say that. Another person who will encourage you. So that's the first thing he says. It's pretty sharp, really. Now, the more familiar remedies are, well, number one, patient endurance, perseverance, staying in the cell. If you're a hermit monk, because see, this thing makes you look out of the windows. It makes you turn the pages of the book. Somebody said it's just like, flicking the TV channels. That's what acedia makes you do, or surfing on the internet. You know, you look at something for 30 seconds, then I'll move on to something else. You know, and it creates this restlessness. And so, try to be restful. Stay in your cell. Hang on in there. The Greek word hupomone, which means remaining underneath. Even though this thing is bashing at you, stay there. In other words, remain faithful to your original commitments and discipline. If you've taken on a particular discipline of prayer and sacraments and reading or whatever it may be, keep it up. Don't say, well, there's no point. You know, I used to read scripture and it was full of light. It was like the sun coming up every time. Now it's just, well, I start to yawn and nod off and put it under my head and fall asleep. But keep going. Keep going. That's one thing. Then, how do we move beyond? A revival of hope we need. A reawakening of sorrow for sin. Because acedia makes us lose the awareness of sin or of the gravity of our sin. So somehow that needs to be rekindled. We need to, yes. And they say this, the memory of death. Think that you're going to die. Think you're going to die today. That's what they say. Well, once you're more than 40, that is really true, actually. But could one say, regarding those last three remedies, that they are like a rediscovery of eschatology? That the last things should become real again. And as a result of that, life ceases to be dull. Life it's not dull at all. Everything becomes very sharply focused. Now here's another surprising remedy. Try some manual work. Do the washing up, you know. Now that's much emphasized by John Cassian, especially with reference to the second letter to the Thessalonians. He talks about this. People living in idleness and just interfering in everyone else's business and not getting on with their own. It's very interesting. Why should it be good? Why should it be good for us, physical work? Because it gets us out of our heads, maybe. It's something real, and often it's something that's got to be done. You know, if you're reading a book, you can, turn the pages, not turn the pages. But you've got, if you're driving a car, if you're driving a car, you can't not drive a car. Even driving a car is a kind of manual work, I suppose. But you can't just, you shouldn't fall asleep at the wheel. And then maybe practical service of others. Get out of yourself and start doing things for others. That might be helpful. Most of all, a return to or refreshing of prayer. Prayer. A prayer which asks for the grace of deliverance. So actually pray, because this is a big demon, this one. It's very hard to shift. And you really do need grace. Even if you do all the other things, you need grace to do them in the first place, and you need the grace of being freed. You need to seek the face of the Lord in prayer. Edith Stein used to pray at one stage in her life, anyway, used to pray long hours at night. She was when she was working as a teacher, and people, and someone said to her, well, don't you get tired? And she was an exceptional lady, and she said, tired? Tired with him? Tired with him? There we are. Saying the Psalms. They always come back to that, the monks. But this underpins the other remedies. Now here's another wonderful piece of wisdom from Evagrius, and you can put this into modern terms very easily. Set a measure for yourself in every work, and do not let up until you have completed it. Set a measure. Don't take on everything. Take on one thing, measured, and see it through. That brings a little sense of satisfaction. Then move on to the next thing. So that's the work side. And then the prayer side, pray with understanding and intensity. Pray hard, we might say. And the spirit of acedia will flee from you. So there's measure and balance in work and a real prayer. And then the sloth will clamber back up the tree and go to sleep on the branch and leave you in peace. Well, now these remedies maybe prepare the way for what some of you perhaps from Eastern Europe especially would know of Father Tomáš Halik, who's a Czech writer, Czech priest. And he calls it second wind Christianity. And he even suggests that contemporary Western Christianity is experiencing a phase collectively of acedia, a sort of midlife crisis, a season of lethargy and drowsiness. Now, this is, something perhaps to which the Europeans among us are more prone. But original faith, for example, our inherited Christianity or our first fervours, even the excitement of the new movements. It's very interesting how many of the new movements in the church are going through major crises now. Major crises. I mean, the Legionaries of Christ rather spectacularly, but others as well. They've had this wonderful, they've been the opposite of acedia, full of zeal, full of enthusiasm, full of youthfulness, everything going their way. And suddenly, it's turned out that, for example, their founder was not quite such a saint as they thought. Suddenly they find themselves racked by division. And so it's being shaken, experience of being shaken, and the previous certainties go. And that's what Father Halleck calls the first shock that can come upon you. And it's rather like what he takes the disciples on the road to Emmaus. They have had this terrible shock of Jesus' death. And everything they had pinned their hopes on has fallen to pieces. All gone. We hoped that he would be the one who would redeem Israel. We hoped, but that has gone. And so it was a debacle, you might say. But to this state, this is a very crucial moment. If this happens in your life, or in the church, or however, individually or together. But to that can succeed a second shock, a recognition that Christ is alive and is walking with me. The second tremor, he says, is confronting and overcoming the despair and resignation that one is tempted to fall prey to at moments of debacle, thereby finding an assurance of a different order. The certainty comes back, but in a different way, which slowly pierces, as a ray of hope, the darkness into which the shaken are plunged. Okay, now that's, again, perhaps a little melodramatic. But nonetheless, these things can happen in our life. These things can happen. And it's good to remember that story of the road to Emmaus. Downcast they were. And then they're turned round and they go back to Jerusalem. But most of all, St. Thomas says about Sloth, acedia, that it is contrary to the joy of charity, the joy of love, in other words. The joy of love. That's what can happen in a marriage, I suppose. The joy of love goes out of it, and a sort of dullness can succeed. But so also in our life with God, that this joy of love goes. And so in a way, so far as there is something that's the opposite of acedia, it is this joy of love. The joy of love. So that's what I suppose we need to pray for. So there we are, that's the death of Sloth. Thank you.